Hello students, this is Mr. Hart, and in this lesson we want to talk about how to get the components of a computer to work together to do all the things we do every day on a computer. Now last time we looked at all the different pieces and why you need them, but specifically we want to look at how they work together to do these things that we need. Okay. So the first thing we need to understand is this distinction between hardware and software. Okay. So hardware is the physical components that make up the computer. Again, what we talked about last time. The RAM, the hard drive, the case, the power supply, the CPU, the motherboard, etc. Whereas the software is the actual program and code that runs the computer. Now, the software is super important because all these pieces that we put together wouldn't be able to do anything unless they had some way of knowing how to talk to each other and what they want to do and what they need to do. That's all in the software side. And so today I want you to have a better understanding of how software runs and how it works with the hardware. Okay, so I want you to watch the following slide because it has something that is truly amazing, but we don't think about that often and I think we take for granted. Okay, so watch closely here. Okay. We have something super amazing going on. We are typing text into a program. Okay, so you may not think that's that amazing. In fact, you probably use Word or a program like it on a daily basis in school. Okay, but if you think about all the different pieces that had to talk to each other for this to work, it is actually quite incredible. Okay, so let's think about all the different pieces of the computer that need to talk together to make this happen. Okay, it is surprising, really, that it works so well and so seamlessly that we never even have to think about it. Okay, so let's start with our computer setup. Okay, and we want to practice tracing all the different steps that we need to take. Okay, so I'm going to grab my pen here, and this is what I want you to do. I want you to think about if I type something on the keyboard into Microsoft Word, what had to happen inside the computer? Okay, so the first step is obviously you input something through the keyboard. Okay, so your typed letter or your typed phrase, whatever it is, first has to go from the keyboard to the motherboard. It always has to go to the motherboard because that's the connection to everything, right? It relays everything to all the different pieces. Okay, when the motherboard gets that input, what it's going to do is essentially ask the RAM what's currently on the screen, because remember, the RAM is responsible for everything about the current state of the computer. Okay, what's running in the background, what's on the screen. Okay, and it's going to say, hey, the user just clicked on something. What did they click on, or what did they type? Okay, and the RAM is going to notify the motherboard essentially that Microsoft Word is running and they typed a letter inside the document. Okay, so that goes back to the motherboard. Okay, that information is then sent to the CPU that knows how to run that program. Right, the CPU is the one that runs Word, and it says, oh, the user typed something. I need to change something about the program. In this case, it just adds it to the document. Okay, so that goes to the CPU. Okay, goes back to the motherboard, and now it needs to send that to the RAM again, saying, hey, I updated what's on the screen, and then it needs to send it to the monitor to change what you're seeing. Okay, so there's a lot of steps there, but let's go back through them. Okay, you input a letter. The motherboard asks the RAM, hey, what's running right now? The RAM notifies that it's Microsoft Word or whatever program that you type the letter into. The CPU then makes the appropriate changes, does the appropriate calculations, whatever. Okay, and then it lets the RAM know that things changed, and it outputs that change to the screen. Okay, now this isn't a perfect representation. There's actually hundreds of sub-processes that are going on to make something simple like that happen. Okay, so we could even go into more detail. But this is the level I want you to understand is when you do something on your computer, a whole bunch of pieces had to talk to each other to make that work. Okay? Let's do another example. Okay? I'm going to go ahead and try and delete all this that I just drew. Okay. Let's go back to our pen. Okay, so now let's say you click on a photo to open it. Okay, maybe you're opening in Photoshop or another program or just viewing it. Okay. So again, you mouse click, which immediately goes to the motherboard. Okay. The motherboard says, hey RAM, what did they click on? Okay, and the RAM says, well, they clicked on the photo file, so you should open up the photo software. Okay. The motherboard says, okay, I need that photo and the software to run it. So in this case, because this is something that's stored on your computer, it needs to go to your hard drive and say, hey, you remember that program we used to open photos? And do you remember that photo that the user just clicked on? I need those now. Will you give them to me? And the hard drive says, sure, here's that program and here's the photo. That information then goes back through the motherboard and to the CPU that processes the software. Okay. And then again, it says, okay, the software is running, the photo is now displayed. Let's let the RAM know, and let's let the monitor know that we changed the display. Okay. So very similar to what happened before. You input something, you talk to RAM, right? What's on the screen, etc. The only difference is this time, because something in memory needed to be accessed, something in storage, a photo and a program, we now had to ask the hard drive to give us those. Okay, so click goes to motherboard. Motherboard asks the RAM, what's on the screen? What did the user do? Okay. Then the RAM says, get this program from the hard drive and this photo. Those go to the hard drive gives them back. That goes to the CPU, and the CPU updates the RAM and the display. Okay. Now, if this sounds all a little bit of wishy-washy, not exactly how it's working, again, that's probably because it is a little wishy-washy and not exactly how it's working, because there's a bunch of sub-processes. But I want you to think about this level of detail of who would need to know, what pieces would need to know what has changed and what has occurred. Okay. So if you list these in a slightly different step when you're doing the homework, or a slightly different order when you're doing the homework, that's okay. Because again, there's a lot of things that happen here. And so if you forget to mention that the motherboard routes the connection, etc., that's okay. But again, focus on who knows what changes, who needs to talk to who in these pieces for these changes to occur. Okay? All right, let's talk about a couple other things really quickly. First is a couple of other software things you should know, especially about your computer, and that is what the drivers are. Okay, so drivers are the software programs that run just the components, just these pieces. Okay, they're not a program you really open up like Microsoft Word or your internet browser. They're just running locally on the machine, and they just tell the components how to work. Okay, the drivers are responsible for all this stuff we were talking about. How do you communicate between these pieces and who talks to who? That's all with the driver software. You never touch it, really, but you need to make sure it is running properly for your computer to run properly. So, for example, every time you plug in a USB device, you'll probably notice in the bottom right corner on Windows especially, it'll say, installing new device. What it's doing is getting the driver from online and running that driver so now that the USB can talk to the other things on your computer. Okay. The other really important one is the BIOS. Okay, or BIOS depending on who you ask. I say BIOS. Okay, but it stands for Basic Input and Output System. Okay, and it's the very, very rudimentary software that runs the motherboard itself. Okay, and if this does not work, your computer will not turn on. Okay, you may have noticed when you turn on a Windows machine in particular, okay, or even a Mac sometimes, before it gets to the Windows screen, there's a screen that's black and maybe has the company logo, and on on the bottom may say something like, press F2 to start BIOS or start safe mode. Okay, this is the very rudimentary software that just runs the motherboard, so you can even install programs on Windows and other things like that. Install Windows at all. Okay, if you can't run the motherboard, nothing can talk to each other. So you have to have the BIOS running first. Okay. So again, on drivers, if you're using Windows, you can just click on Device Manager and you can see all the drivers that you have. Sometimes if a device isn't working, it's helpful to go update the driver to the most recent software. That's a common step. So that's something I would be familiar with, is at least opening up that Device Manager and being able to see the different drivers that you have. So if something goes wrong, you can update it appropriately. Okay. And then again, the BIOS, at least in Windows, if you press F2 on most machines, right as the computer's booting up, you just hit F2 really fast. It'll take you to a screen that looks like this, and it's just all the basic stuff that the computer needs to run. We're not talking even Windows, just, you know, which hard drive am I using? You know, which device is the memory on? You know, simple things like that. Okay, and so again, you don't generally need to touch this, and I wouldn't recommend touching it if you don't know what you're doing. But occasionally, if something's not booting correctly, like your hard drive isn't booting Windows, you can go into the BIOS and see if something's wrong and configured wrong. Okay. Again, I'd recommend having like a computer tech person do that if you really are having issues. But you can find things on YouTube, and if you really want to, you can explore this more. Okay. Sometimes it's also called the UEFI. Okay, that's kind of the updated BIOS system. Okay, and then on Mac, this changes on occasion, but right now I think the way you do it is you hold Command and Option and O and F when you're booting your computer, and then it brings you to this screen that's just basically code, and you can type in Mac boot and it'll bring you to the BIOS as well. Okay, so again, before your Windows or Mac machine runs Windows or Mac, it is first running the BIOS first to get the motherboard running, so that all the other pieces can talk to each other. Okay, so that is it for today. So we talked about how machines work with all these different components, again, talking to each other, and again, this distinction between hardware and software, and specifically about drivers and BIOS. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. Let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for watching.